leaders be astronauts, be champions, standing in the Hall of Fame. And the world's gonna know your name.
It is great to have you with us. We've been in a book series through the book of Hebrews in the New Testament for, I think, 16 weeks now. And we're in chapter 11, which is called the Hall of Faith. And last Sunday, Pastor Justin Staple at the Marquette campus and Pastor Michael Bailey here at the Harvey campus brought the first message from the book of Hebrews chapter 11. And for me, it was fascinating to sit in both of those services and to hear two men who worked together on the sermon and were preaching from the same outline and heard two really very different messages, both biblical, both very excellent messages, but just very different. And so it's kind of a cool thing. And that's the thing about God's Word that I really love, is that there are so many facets to it that we could take a long time discussing and describing anything. In fact, we've mentioned a number of times that it's believed that what we have as the book of Hebrews in our Bible is actually a sermon that was being preached to churches that were predominantly Jewish people, and then someone transcribed it and made it into a letter or a book as we have it that continued to be circulated among the churches. But if this was a sermon, what we have as Hebrews chapter 5, it would take about 5 minutes to say it, 5 minutes to read it. And here we are, we're going to spend 3 or 4 weeks talking about this one chapter alone. And you might think that's kind of strange, but that's actually the advantage of being in this New Testament era. We have this word, and we do have to go back and we have to understand the audience, and we have to understand the context, and then the way that the book is put together, and then we get to apply it to ourselves. And so that's what we're going to do this morning. Now, Hebrews chapter 11 is a fascinating chapter. It is without doubt the most specific and the most inclusive chapter on faith in the entire Bible. It's the longest one passage that talks about the same subject, that subject being faith, in the entire Bible. So it's a very popular and it's a very important chapter. And over the last number of weeks, as I've read the chapter over and over and over again, can I be honest with you? I have first found myself being frustrated by it, and then I found myself being somewhat discouraged by it. And here's why. Because I read about the faith that was talked about last week, that we're going to talk about this week, and I get bummed out because I think, that's not me. I don't have faith like that. I don't know if I could ever have faith like that. And so I entitled the message this week, Attainable Faith, because there is something about the way this is conveyed that I think if we don't look at the bigger picture, we're going to miss, and we're going to go, oh, faith. Faith is amazing. Faith is what all of us should have. The more faith, the better. But if we're honest, we look at ourselves and say, I don't think I could ever attain anywhere close to that type of faith. And I want to tell you today that real, vibrant, active, life-changing faith is available and accessible to all of us, to all of you, to me. And that's where we're going. Now let me back up a second and ask you a question. And this is a question you don't have to answer. You might not even know how to answer it. But here's the question. If in 2 weeks you could make $2 billion, would you want to? No? Okay. $2 billion in 2 weeks has been made. And it's been these past 2 weeks. Here's how. A movie came out last weekend, and this weekend marks the 2-week point. And so far, the Avengers Endgame movie, and what's that character? Who is she? I mean, I know it's Scarlett Johansson, but what is her character in the movie? You don't know? Okay, fine. I know some of you are mumbling it. You're too shy or embarrassed to say that you know what the character's name is. Black Widow, okay? I know Captain America. I know that that's Thor, right? I know that this is the Hulk before he has a temper tantrum. I do not know what this rodent's name is. Rocket. Rocket the raccoon. Isn't that a Beatles song? No. Okay. So, this movie came out, and in 2 weeks, worldwide, it has grossed $2 billion. Now, here's the problem with saying, can I make that much money in 2 weeks, and if I could, I would. You have to have hundreds of millions of dollars to invest in making the movie, to hiring all the crews and the animators and the stars and blah, blah, blah. You have to have hundreds of millions of dollars to make billions of dollars, but if you can, do it. If you can, you would. But I look at this, and I look at the phenomenon of superheroes, and I have a bigger question. Because there is this, not only in America, but around the world, there is this fascination with superheroes. In fact, all of these movies that came out in just the year 2018 that featured characters from Marvel and DC comic books, and that's where these characters come from. Movies like Black Panther, The Avengers Infinity War, Ant-Man and the Wasp, Deadpool 2, X-Men Dark Phoenix, Aquaman, Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse. The total box office worldwide for movies based on Marvel and DC comic book characters, $19 billion in 2018. So somebody's watching these movies, and I will confess to you that it's not me. Now, that's not a put down, that's not me being superior. It's me seeing a little bit of one of these movies here or there and going, I'm not interested. But I know a year ago, when we were on our mission trip to Guatemala, August of 2018, that the Avengers Infinity War had just come out, and not just come out, but it had been out a little while. And on the airplane ride down to Guatemala, on the back of people's seats was the screen, and I saw a number of people choosing to watch Avengers Infinity War on their screens. And I saw just enough of it to know that that was not my cup of tea. Matter of fact, what it reminded me of, seriously and quite literally, was like an episode of WWE Big Time Wrestling. Because I was watching, and all of a sudden, the good guys, the superheroes, they're winning the battle. And all the electrical currents and blasts and everything that they're doing are going their way and in their favor. Then all of a sudden the tides turn, and the bad guys are winning. Then all of a sudden the tide turns, and the good guys are winning. Then the tides turn, and it's like, enough of that. I can't stand that. So, that is not being me superior or anything like that. But I look at $19 billion worth of people's money saying, I want to watch these fictional characters do their thing. And here's my question, why? Why the preoccupation with superheroes? And I think I know part of the answer to that. I believe that the draw for a lot of people when it comes to something like this is that real life can be so discouraging. Not just mundane, not boring, discouraging. Because we are surrounded by people that have been lifted up, exalted, held in high esteem. And we watch them one after another fail and give up on doing the right things. And people that we trusted betray that trust. And we're just discouraged by the plight of humanity, by our human brokenness, our human frailty. Here's the thing about superheroes. They are strong. When the people around them are weak, the superheroes are strong. They are confident. They know the right thing to do, and they do it. They don't have this moral equivocation where they can't decide whether they should do the right thing or not. They're confident when we are shaken. They are virtuous when we, those around them, are corrupt. They ultimately don't give in. And even though they're not flawless, because every superhero has their flaw, right? Their weakness. With Superman, it's blatantly obvious. He is not a fan of kryptonite, for example. But all of them have something that is like their flaw, and when the enemy knows it, they start exploiting that flaw. but they are less flawed than we are, and that gives us hope. And so as I've been thinking about the Hall of Fame in Hebrews chapter 11, this extensive writing on faith, I think I am intimidated by these people. And I'm even somewhat discouraged because the way it is presented in Hebrews chapter 11, they seem unlike me so much. They seem like superheroes of the faith. So how could I ever be like that? How could I ever have that kind of faith? So here's my question. Did the presenter of Hebrews, was this their intention? To give us the impression that Old Testament heroes did not have flaws and therefore had perfect faith? That is a legitimate and important question. What is the author, what is the speaker of this sermon, what is he trying to say? That's why we have to go back again to the context, to the audience that this was written to. Because the audience that this was written to, unlike us, was very, very Jewish. Now, they had become followers of Jesus Christ. They had come to embrace Jesus as their Messiah. But prior to that, for 20, 30, 40, whatever number of years, they grew up in the synagogue, in the temple, deeply immersed in the rituals and the routines of that, making the prescribed sacrifices, trying to keep all of the Old Testament laws. That was their life. And you know what bedtime was for a Jewish child? Hearing the stories of the Old Testament saints. Hearing the stories about Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Noah and Enoch. That was bedtime story for all these people. And not just the highlights, all the stories. And so here's the reality that we must not lose focus of this morning. That the audience that first received this message that we're looking at today knew well the entire story of these characters. Warts and all. What we're going to see in Hebrews chapter 11 is the highlights, the high moments of their life. But if you don't take the whole person and their whole story into account, Hebrews 11 can become a discouraging, unattainable statement of what faith looks like. And so the goal today is to understand faith in the context of these people and their whole lives and how they got to the point where they made the Hall of Fame. That make sense? Good. We're going there anyways. Here we go. So let's talk about the truth of Abraham's faith. Because I contend that whether it's Abel or Enoch or Noah or Abraham, that they had struggles, that they had temptations, that they had doubts and they had fears just like us. Here's the truth about Abraham's faith. Last week, we talked about the first part of it, and Abraham is the most mentioned person in this whole Hall of Faith. There are quite a few verses dedicated to him. Last week, Justin and Michael talked about verses 2 through 12 in regards to him, about the call that God came to him. Here he is, a heathen, pagan, idol worshiper. God says, Abraham, or Abram at that point in time, get up and leave where you are and leave your family and go to a place that I will show you, to an unknown location. And Abram said, okay. That's how the story starts. And then it talked about the promise of a child, that God was going to give this older man and his older wife a miraculous child, a son from the two of them that would become the start of a great nation of people through whom everyone on the planet Earth was going to be blessed. Jesus, they don't know him as Jesus, but the promised one, the Messiah, will come through you, Abraham, ultimately into the world. And so the story of Abram continues in Hebrews 11. By faith, Abraham, when God tested him, offered Isaac as a sacrifice. He who had embraced the promises was about to sacrifice his one and only son. Even though God had said to him, it is through Isaac, this son that I'm asking you to kill, it is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned. Abraham reasoned, this is his thought process, that God could even raise the dead, and so, in a manner of speaking, he did receive Isaac back from the dead. Now, here's what he's doing. He's referring back to Genesis chapter 22. Really, one of the most mind-blowing stories in the whole Bible, I think. That God, after he finally gave Abraham and Sarah a son, some 13 or so years later, and it's not, no one knows for sure, but they look at the story and how it unfolds and what Isaac is able to do at this point in his life, help Abraham carry wood, etc., understand the sacrificial system, that he's probably about 13 or so years old when God comes to Abraham and says, take your son, your only son, Isaac, sacrifice him to me. Now, the way Genesis chapter 22 reads, and this is critically important, when this comes to Abraham, he doesn't say, what? He doesn't say, I need you to say that to me again, or I need you, God, to explain your logic to me. This doesn't make sense. The way Genesis chapter 22 reads, Abraham did not argue and he did not doubt. It says, the next morning he got up and took the boy with him. What? It's a 3-day trip. Wouldn't you love to know what that conversation was about on the way? They get to the base of a mountain. They leave a couple of servants there. He says, me and the boy are going up to worship God. On the way up, Isaac turns to his dad and he says, Dad, we've got fire and we've got wood. You got a knife, Dad, but where's the sacrifice? Abraham said, God himself will provide the sacrifice. This is incredible. What on earth is going on here? You see, without a doubt, his willingness to sacrifice Isaac is the pinnacle example. It is the highest example of Abraham's faith. Maybe one of the highest examples of faith in the entire Scripture. Those of us that have children, if you are in your right mind, you cannot even imagine being asked to do something like this. But here's what I want you to understand today. If we don't know the preceding stories, what happened between Genesis chapter 12, when Abraham is called, and Genesis chapter 22, when he's asked to sacrifice his son, his only son, Isaac, then we won't understand that it took 50 years for Abraham to get from the call to the promise to where he is saying, God, if you say, sacrifice my son, I will. Reasoning that God could simply call Isaac back to life from there. There are lots of episodes of faith, but there are also lots of episodes of failure in Abraham's life from the starting point to this point. For example, twice in Abraham's life, he is so afraid of the people around him, the cultures that he and his wife are journeying through, that he encourages Sarah to lie about who she is and what her relationship with Abraham is. The first one is found in Genesis chapter 12. So this is right after God says, God calls him and he says, okay, I'll go and leave my family and I'm on my way. First place he goes, he's approaching the border of Egypt. Abram said to his wife Sarai, look, you are a very beautiful woman. And when the Egyptians see you, they will say, this is his wife. Let's kill him, then we can have her. So please, tell them you are my sister, then they will spare my life and treat me well because of their interest in you. Now, I do not know if you are into 75-year-old women, but apparently, Sarah, at age 75, was still an incredibly good-looking woman. And listen, nothing except that comment. She's incredibly beautiful. Abraham knows it. And so he says, listen, when you get there, you're going to have to lie about who you are in relationship to me. Now, this kind of fear, you don't really hear talked about much in Abraham's life. But this isn't the only time he did it. Much later, after God had proven himself faithful to Abraham a number of other times, he still falls into this trap again. And so we are going to have to see what it is that God does in Abraham's life. Because at this point, right here, at this point, he really doesn't believe that God is able to protect him and Sarah. Not yet. Then, probably one of the greatest failures in Abraham and Sarah's life is their unwillingness to believe that God could actually pull off his promise, his covenant promise to them. And so they decide that they will come up with a way to help God out. You see, God had promised them that child, that offspring. And in fact, he said when he changed Abram's name from Abram to Abraham, he said, I'm going to change it from Abram, which is father, which Abraham was not at that point, to Abraham, which means the father of many. So it's like, let's go from ironic to ridiculous here. You have no children. I'm going to change your name from Papa to many times over Papa. It's not logical. And so here's what Sarah says. Sarai, Abram's wife, had not been able to bear children for him, but she had an Egyptian servant named Hagar. So Sarai said to Abram, the Lord has prevented me from having children. Go and sleep with my servant. Perhaps I can have children through her. Because, you see, that's the way it was in that culture. Their understanding was if you had a servant and they bore a child through your husband, that child was actually yours. And I know that they said it that way and it was kind of seen that way, but trust me, when you see Sarah's reaction later on, it didn't feel that way. It wouldn't feel that way now. It didn't even feel that way then. But look at this. Abram is such a giant of faith. When his wife says this to him, what did he do? Abram agreed with her proposal. Oh, you want me to, okay, forget it. He agreed with her proposal. And a son was born. And that son's name was Ishmael. And it was one of the worst things that ever happened to the descendants of Abraham. Because that is where the Arab people of today, who are the perpetual enemies for decades and millennia now of the Jewish people, came from. So God comes to Abraham again, and he restates the promise again and says the covenant still holds true again. And this time there is enough doubt that there is some laughter at God. God comes to Abraham in the form of a being, a human, that is actually talking to Abraham in a tent. And Sarah overhears the conversation as he reiterates, no, it is going to be you with your wife Sarah, who is now long been menopausal, who is going to give you this child. And Sarah hears that promise restated, and she laughs. And the guest comes out and says, Sarah, did you laugh at that promise? Oh, no, I didn't laugh. He goes, yes, you did. And so when this son is born to you, by next year you will have a son, and you will call him Isaac, which means he laughs. And so they continue on. My point is basically this, that if you look at the entirety of Abraham's life, it is through his many failures that Abraham grows to trust God. It is through his failures. It's through his doubts. It's even through his mistakes and his mess-ups and his sin that God proves himself to be faithful, proves himself to be loving, proves himself to be a God who keeps his promises. And it takes Abraham 50 years to grow to trust God to the point where when God comes to him and says, take your son, your only son Isaac, and sacrifice him to me, Abraham doesn't argue. Please don't think that it happened instantly or overnight, or that Abraham was just so different from you that he reacted that way instinctively, when for us it would be a struggle. It was a struggle for him too. And then the author of Hebrews continues with the truth about some other patriarchs, and he just touches on them, and so will we. Starting with verse 20. By faith, Isaac, that son, blessed Jacob and Esau in regard to their future. And let me just stop there and just say, he basically told them that they would both have a piece of land in the future as their inheritance. By faith, Jacob, when he was dying, blessed each of Joseph's sons and worshipped as he leaned on the top of his staff. And then by faith, Joseph, when his end was near, spoke about the exodus of the Israelites from Egypt and gave instructions concerning the burial of his bones. Now, all of these people, they have a little common thread, and that is that all of them are people who will never, with their own eyes and never with their own feet, see or touch the promised land. That's the big promise. Not only that you will become a nation of people, but you will be a nation of people with a really good land to call your own. And one after the other never actually saw that promise realized. That's what the author of Hebrews is pointing out, that they believed that promise and kept passing it down from generation to generation. But here's the truth about each one of these patriarchs that are mentioned. First of all, he laughs. Isaac was not that great of a father. He played favorites. In fact, he and his wife Rebekah each had a favorite son. Esau and Jacob were twins, and when they were born, Esau just barely came out ahead of Jacob. And he grew up to be a man's man. He was his dad's favorite because Isaac liked food made out of wild game. And Esau was always out hunting something. And so one day he brought him possum stew, and the next day he brought him raccoon rigatoni, and the next day he brought him skunk cabbage, I don't know. But he was a hunter, and he would bring him the wild game, and Isaac just loved that. Jacob was a gentler young man, and he loved to stay around the tents, and he loved to hang out near Mama. Some would have called him, probably did call him a mama's boy. So both of these boys got treated differently, but Isaac playing favorites did not go well. Esau then, the one who was moments older than his brother, was short-sighted and he was hot-headed. We know that he was short-sighted because one day he came in from a hunting expedition, hadn't caught anything, and he was starving to death, he thought. If I don't eat something right now, I'm going to die. I don't know if you've ever felt like that. You'll hear people say, I'm so hungry, I don't think I can survive. Well, it's usually not true. But he comes in, and there's some food to be eaten, and he says, I want that food right now. And Jacob cunningly says, you give me your birthright, your right to 2/3 of Dad's inheritance, and I'll give you this bowl of soup. Horrible trade. Short-sighted maneuver. But he did it. And then later on, he resented and hated his brother, wanted to kill his brother for a long time as a result of it. That's the hot-headed part. Well, what about Jacob? He got the birthright, and he ended up getting the blessing. But he was spoiled by his mom, and he was deceptive. You see, these patriarchs of the nation of Israel, they have their highlights, but they all have their lowlights too. All have areas that they struggled and failed. So finally, we need to talk about this, and this is important. He goes to the truth about Moses' faith. And in the mind of the Hebrew people, there would have been a little bit of difficulty trying to decide who their favorite superhero of the history of Israel was, because obviously it all started with Abraham, and without Abraham, there would have been none of them. But if it hadn't been for Moses, they would have been in slavery in Egypt. They were in the process of being exterminated by the Pharaoh. So if it wasn't for Moses, they wouldn't have been delivered. And if it wasn't for Moses, they wouldn't have had the law, which was incredibly important to them. So it's like always this Abraham versus Moses debate. But here's what Hebrews 11 says about Moses. By faith, starts with his parents. Moses' parents hid him for 3 months after he was born because they saw that he was no ordinary child, and they were not afraid of the king's edict. Verse 24 talks about now Moses himself. By faith, Moses, when he had grown up, refused to be known as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He chose to be mistreated along with the people of God rather than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. He regarded disgrace for the sake of Christ as of greater value than the treasures of Egypt, because he was looking ahead to his reward. By faith, he left Egypt, not fearing the king's anger. He persevered because he saw him who was invisible. By faith, he kept the Passover and the application of blood, so that the destroyer of the firstborn would not touch the firstborn of Israel. By faith, the people passed through the Red Sea as on dry land, but when the Egyptians tried to do so, they were drowned. Now, our previous series, as it happens at Olivet, was through the book of Exodus, where this whole story of Moses, his birth, him growing up, him going in and delivering the Israelite people from Egypt, we talked about that in detail. So it's really cool that we have that context. But we need to understand or be reminded of some of the things that were actually a part of Moses' characteristics as he grew up and as we see this story unfold. The first is that he was impulsive. He was impulsive. As Moses grew up and realized, probably because he spent a number of years in his Israelite household, hearing the Old Testament stories, hearing about Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and all of those things, he knows that Israel has a very specific God who says, you must worship me. And then he transitions into Pharaoh's household as the adopted daughter of Pharaoh's daughter, or the adopted son of Pharaoh's daughter. He still was a boy. And he hears all the stories and the mythology of Egypt. And there are many gods in Egypt. But somehow in that whole process, his certainty that he was really an Israelite, really a Jew, became rock solid. And that led him to this. Exodus 2. Many years later, when Moses had grown up, he went out to visit his own people, the Hebrews. He knew that they were his people. And he saw how hard they were forced to work. During his visit, he saw an Egyptian beating one of his fellow Hebrews. After looking in all directions to make sure that no one was watching, Moses killed the Egyptian and hid the body in the sand. The next day, when Moses went out to visit his people again, he saw two Hebrew men fighting. Oh, so it wasn't just bad Egyptians. Okay. These two Hebrews are fighting with each other. Why are you beating up your friend? Moses said to the one who had started the fight. The man replied, who appointed you to be our prince or our judge? Are you going to kill me as you killed the Egyptian yesterday? Then Moses was afraid, thinking, everyone knows what I did. And sure enough, Pharaoh had heard about what had happened, and he tried to kill Moses. But Moses fled from Pharaoh and went to live in the land of Midian. Now, let me ask you a very important question. Because when you read the account in Hebrews chapter 11, it says Moses did not fear Pharaoh. But it's clear in this passage in Exodus that he was afraid of being found out for that murder, and when he knew for certain that Pharaoh knew and was going to try to kill him, he fled in fear. Well, here's my point. That Hebrews 11 is not talking about this incident when he was about 40 years old. The incident where he comes back and he is fearless in the face of Pharaoh happens 40 years later. It took Abraham 50 years to get up his nerve to be one who would say, God, if you say it, I'll do it. It took Moses 40 years to get to the point where he was willing to go back to Egypt. Now, we don't know exactly what Moses was thinking when he saw this attack going on and decided to kill the Egyptian. But he sees something very troubling and he just reacts. He attacks and he kills them. And it's likely that he knew enough about God's call on his life that there was something special about him, and I don't mean in an egotistical way, but he just had a sense that God was going to do something with him and through him to deliver his fellow Israelites, that he thought, this is the time. This is my opportunity. And that's why he attacked that Egyptian, and he thought that the Israelites would then realize, this is our champion. This is our deliverer. But it wasn't to happen at that point in time. So he's impulsive. And then, of course, he's fearful. He's fearful. He runs, and it's not until those 40 years later that he has the courage to go back and the sense of being called to deliver the Jews. But even that was serious hesitation, because when God comes to him and says, Moses, now's the time and you're my man, what does Moses do? He hems, and he haws, and he drags his feet, and he makes excuses. He is full of doubt and insecurity. Exodus 4. Here's God talking to him. through a burning bush saying, this is what I want to do with you. Go to Pharaoh, tell him, let my people go. But Moses pleaded with the Lord, oh Lord, I'm not very good with words. I never have been, and I'm not now, even though you have spoken to me. I get tongue-tied and my words get tangled. Then the Lord asked Moses, who makes a person's mouth? Who decides whether people speak or do not speak, hear or do not hear, see or do not see? Is it not I, the Lord? Now go. I will be with you as you speak, and I will instruct you in what to say. But Moses again pleaded, Lord, please send someone else. This is not a confident Moses. This is not a quickly obedient Moses. This is a flawed, fearful, self-doubting, God-doubting man at this point in time. But what happens in the chapters that follow are that God works with him. He gives him a helper. He gives him a spokesman to talk when Moses is tongue-tied, his brother Aaron. He gives him tools to work with. He gives him miracles to perform. He even gives him words in advance to say. When the people ask you this, say this. When the Pharaoh asks you this, this is what you are to tell him. You see, so similar to Abraham, it is the relentless faithfulness of God that ends up transforming Moses. God has to work with him through his failure, through his doubt. And so to a group of people, now jumping back to the first century, to the Jewish people that were receiving this message and this letter, a group of people who had believed for most of their life that the law and the rituals and the sacrifices, those were the ways that a person was made right with God. Just keep the law and keep the sacrificial system. The author wants them to know that it's not just now, but it's always been that a person is made right with God by faith, and faith is always demonstrated by obedience. Right relationship with God has always been by faith. For Abraham, for Noah, for Abel, for Enoch, for Moses, it's always been a matter of faith, trusting God enough to show it by obedience. Here's what I want you to understand. The kind of faith that God rewards for us and forever has been trusting him enough to simply do what he says. We wrestle with faith. To us, faith is sort of this abstract concept. Faith is when I just get really emotional and when I can bring myself to believe in the impossible. That's faith. Faith is when I'm willing to take an incredible risk. I'm doing something or I'm about to do something that other people look at and say, that makes no sense at all. We go, I know, because it's faith. I think faith is illogical. Faith is not illogical at all. Faith is simply trusting God enough to do what he says. So James, in the New Testament, takes Abraham from the Old Testament, brings him into the context of faith in action, and says this. James 2. Don't you remember that our ancestor Abraham was shown to be right with God by his actions when he obeyed? When he offered his son Isaac on the altar. You see, his faith, what God had said, and his actions worked together. His actions made his faith complete. And so it happened, just as the scriptures say. Abraham believed God, and God counted it to him as righteousness. Counted him as righteous because of his faith. He was even called the friend of God. So you see, we are shown to be right with God by what we do, not by faith alone. And by the way, he's wedding faith and action, but he's not downplaying or denigrating faith at all. He's saying faith is always shown by obedient action. God reveals something to us, and we embrace it. God says something to us, and we obey it. That's simply what faith is. And by the way, another mistake that we make is that we think that faith is something that is a matter of quality or quantity. That the quantity of faith, if I have a lot of faith, I can do something grand. But you know, the kind of faith that we're talking about today, the kind of faith that can change the course of someone's life, is accessible to someone who is as young as 5 or 6 years of age. God clearly says to do this. I will do it. Here's the takeaway. Really, please. I know every once in a while people say, when people take down the last word in the fill in the blank and start to put their papers away and shuffle their Bibles and slam their Bibles shut, does that bother you? No, it doesn't bother me. I don't even hear it. But for the sake of those around you, would you please not do that for a second and really write down those words, fill in those blanks, and then listen to me very carefully. Every single day, we have the opportunity to show whether we are a people of faith or not. Multiple times a day, we are faced with choices, decisions, opportunities. In those moments to say, yes, I will do what God would want me to do right now. I will do the right thing versus the wrong thing. God says that I should go this direction. I will go that direction instead of over here. To say yes to God in those multiple moments and opportunities every day. That, my friends, is faith. That and only that is faith. I don't care how much you have welling up and bubbling up in your heart. If you're not obeying God in the things that He says to do, you don't have faith. I don't care how big and lofty and grand your thoughts are about God and about what He could accomplish if you just believed Him hard enough. That's not faith. Obeying Him in the simple routine, that is faith. And every one of us has access to faith that will change our lives. And it comes to us one moment at a time, day after day after day. Will you obey me? Will you trust me? Talk to that person? Will you do the thing that's right in this difficult circumstance? Will you choose to turn off your computer instead of clicking on this? Whatever it is, it's those simple choices that show whether we have faith or not. I started this service by singing a song that said, God, your promise still stands. Great is your faithfulness, your faithfulness. I'm still in your hand. This is my confidence. You've never failed me yet. That's why we can have confidence and say, God, if you say it, by your grace working in me, I will obey it, because God doesn't fail. He doesn't fail. It doesn't mean that the path ahead is going to be easy or that the burden is always going to be light. But when we obey Him, that is incredible. He told a parable, kind of a parable. He said to His disciples, if you even have faith the size of a mustard seed, you can say to that mountain, jump in the ocean, and it'll be done. I don't know of anybody that's ever accomplished the feat of saying to a mountain, jump, and it jumps. So that means apparently that no one's ever had faith. He was not talking about immense faith. He was saying, listen, just have a little bit. God, who can do anything, will take care of it. I'm going to pray, and we have a closing song that I think sort of gives us another facet of this. We're going to sing that together, and I'll come up and close the service. Pray with me. God, thank you for the fact that you love us, and so because you love us, you work with us and work with us and work with us. And for some of us, it has been 40 years. For some of us, it has been 50 years that you've been working on us to bring us to the place where when you asked us for that really difficult thing, that really big thing, that we're going to trust you enough to say yes, not argue with you. God, I pray that for all of us, we would take seriously the fact that dozens of times yet today we will have an opportunity to say yes. We will never say yes in the big things, or if we don't say yes to the